Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Today we have New York Times reporter and author Melissa Eddy. We shall chat with Melissa in just a second. But first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Melissa Eddy, she's a journalist based in Berlin who covers German business, economics, and politics for the New York Times. She has covered Chancellor Angela Merkel since she entered office in 2005. A Minnesota native, fluent in German and French, she came to Germany as a Fulbright scholar in 1996. Before joining the International Herald Tribune, now the international edition of the New York Times, in 2015, she was a correspondent for the Associated Press in Frankfurt, Vienna, and the Balkans. Her first book is Merkel's Law, Wisdom from the Woman Who Led the Free World. Melissa, welcome into the back room.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I recently interviewed Max Boot about his new biography of Ronald Reagan, who he found to be quite the complex man and politician full of personal and public contradictions. So I want to know, in researching and writing your book, what were you most surprised to learn about Merkel?
Well, it's interesting because I actually listened to your interview with Max about Reagan, and I thought, wow, there's some similarities there. Only Merkel was different in that she appeared very cold as a politician, and privately she was warm, funny, telling jokes, and very hilarious. I covered Merkel for all 16 years that she was in office, so there weren't so many surprises in researching the book. It was more digging into some of the little details. I guess the one thing that did surprise me was how even when she's out of office, she is still fiercely private, and anyone in her inner circle is still fiercely protective of that privacy. So it's very difficult to get people to tell you all of those anecdotes about her humor and her ability to, not mock, but to parody and sort of parrot the leaders that she's met, which there's always been rumors about these. And indeed, she's a very good mimic, but nobody will give you any details.
Is there anything that you came across that explains that intense privacy? Was there something in her life at some point that triggered that kind of privacy?
Absolutely. So Angela Merkel grew up in the former GDR, the former East Germany under strict socialist state. And her father was a Lutheran pastor, and the Lutheran Church was quite political in the former East Germany. It was sort of another system, if you will, that welcomed in those people who did not agree with the political system of that day, but it was also the church, so the government had to be somewhat delicate. But the government did not really like the church or anyone involved in it, including a pastor's daughter. So from a very early age, Merkel was schooled from her parents, her mother and her father, that what went on at home had to stay at home. And she had to be very careful not to let teachers or even friends know that they listened to West German radio, they read West German publications, they talked about politics, they were critical of the government. So she grew up with almost an inherent suspicion of the outside world, if you will. And I think you can see in following her in politics, she carried that very much into her political persona. This was not a chancellor who was going to bring the press into her home and, pose for pictures of her baking the pies that she would talk about baking, or with her family members at all. That there was a real strict boundary.
Mm-hmm. And in what ways did the fall of the Berlin Wall in November '89 inspire her politically, or inspire her to enter politics?
Right. Well, it also allowed her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even beyond inspiring her, she would have never been able to or dreamed of entering politics had the wall not fallen. Because, again, going back to her history as a pastor's daughter, she was lucky to even be able to study at university. The government had a say in everything, every element of people's lives, including who could study what. And she had wanted to be a teacher, and there was no way that she was going to be a teacher, because to be a teacher, you had to follow the party line. And the government didn't suspect that a member of a pastor's family could do that, and Merkel had always said that she wouldn't have wanted to do that anyway. She became a scientist instead. She said she chose science because as a scientist, you were sure that the facts were the facts. You can't argue with the law of physics. Can't manipulate that, she said. So when the wall fell, there she was, had been a scientist, had a solid career doing that, but she had always yearned for democracy. She had always deeply respected and dreamed of living in a democracy, of being able to even visit a democracy, which she never thought she would do until she retired, which was when Soviet systems believed that people were no longer as useful, if you will, to the system. So they let them go to the States because they figured they'd come back at that stage of their lives. They wouldn't stay. So here she was in her 30s. All of a sudden, the wall falls. There's change happening all around her. There's political parties flooding into the Eastern Berlin from the West. The Western political parties, other political parties are springing up. There's all of this excitement and this action and this sense of being able to create something and of being able to shape the future of the country that she was now going to live in. And so she just showed up initially out of curiosity, she said, and asked around and figured out which political party felt like a home to her. And then she started going to meetings and as she said, making herself useful, because as a scientist, she was one of the few people in the room who knew how to work a computer. You have to remember, this is the 90s. Many East Germans had never seen a personal computer before. And Merkel, having worked with them in the Science Academy, knew how to set it up. So she was setting up computers, and one thing led to another. And the next thing you knew, she decided she wanted to be in the first united German parliament that would convene after the first united election in 1990, and she succeeded.
You know, I don't want to use the word easy, so I'll instead say something like, it's interesting to see how realistic it was at that time for a woman to just say, oh, I think I want to get into politics and then become chancellor. We've seen for decades and decades how women all over the world are leading countries. Yet in this country, shattering that glass ceiling just seems, it's almost like fantasy.
It seems anything but easy.
Yeah, anything but easy. And I often wonder why. Why is it so easy for other countries? We are the great democracy, right? We are this pillar of progress, and this is where everyone in the world wants to come and better themselves, the land of opportunity. But when you really just look at how we've actually governed over the years, almost exclusively with white men, why are other countries, Germany, other places, why is it so much easier and more realistic there than it is here?
It's more possible, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. I don't know that Merkel would say it was easy. However, I think there's one remark on that, Andy, that has always struck me as really interesting is in business in the United States of America, you have far more women in positions of power. Mm-hmm. It took Germany years. It took Germany until Merkel, in her third term in office, passed a law saying that top traded companies on the German stock exchange had to have a certain number of women on their boards in order for women to be able to move up in business. Politics, however, was a different story. And it's different in Europe because in many countries, Germany included, there are quotas where political parties decide that they're going to lay down a law that this many women have to be present. It's not universally accepted. We're seeing this right now at the EU. Ursula von der Leyen, who was also a minister under Merkel, pulled her up from the state, from a state representative that she was. She's trying to push in quotas and parity in Brussels and getting some pushback from some white European men. However, there are countries, states, places, Germany being one of them, that has quotas. And therefore, it has opened doors and allowed women to move into these positions of power. And Merkel herself, what she said, I was a double quota woman. She was a quota. She met the quota of being female. She met the quota of being from the East.
Mm-hmm.
And she was always aware that that gave her this opportunity. She took it and ran with it. Clearly she was not that successful for that many years only because this quota existed. But because that quota existed, it allowed her to get her foot in the door where it otherwise would have been really difficult. And in the States, I think we're completely against that kind of an idea. And it's disputed here as well. But in Merkel's case, she said, I can't argue against quotas because I benefited massively from one.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about her tenure as chancellor for a bit. In the past decade, we've witnessed an alarming wave of right-wing extremism and nationalism in Europe. She was praised for her decision in 2015 and 16 to allow Syrian and Afghani migrants to seek refuge in Germany, which over the last several years has proven pretty successful. What helped shape that decision?
Well, I'll get to that in a second. I have to say, in all fairness, it has proven pretty successful, but at the same time, we are seeing a backlash amongst the far right and a rise of the far right in Germany, especially in the former East that she hails from. So it is far from perfect. But at that time, in 2015, what led up to that decision, you had sort of this chain of events where you'd had Italy and Greece already, just heaving under the number of people who were arriving on their shores and saying, "Hey, we need help with this." And then you had a group of refugees that made it as far as Budapest in Hungary and were trapped in this train station. And the images of all of these people sort of trapped in a train station suffering in Germany bring back images of World War II, certainly. And when those people, they knew they wanted to get to Germany being the wealthiest country in Central Europe, being the powerhouse of the European economy. And so they started marching towards, they just said, we're headed to Germany. They started marching down the highway, and Merkel was forced to make a decision what to do with these people. Germany's border was actually open because of agreements within the European Union, the southern border to Austria, which then has a border to Hungary. These are all open. So her decision was actually not to open the border, but whether or not to close it. And she realized if she was going to close it, these people were determined. They had made their way from Syria to Turkey, up through the Balkans, as far as Budapest. They were not going to be stopped by just being told, sorry, no room in the inn kind of thing. It would require force. And she remembered force in the Prague Spring, where the communists crushed down an uprising. And she also was keenly aware of Germany's World War II past. Mm-hmm. And she did not want to be the one that was going to call out the police, armed forces, whatever it would have taken, against these unarmed people who were looking for refuge.
Mm-hmm. And just as a point of clarification, we're seeing the same thing here in the United States, as you referred to with the question of success or perhaps acceptance by the far right of these migrants. We see that with Haitians in Springfield, Ohio. They're actually integrated into the community quite successfully, but it's not faring well with the right-wing extremists who want to paint them as cat and dog eaters and vermin or whatever Donald Trump likes to use. So there's sort of an interesting dichotomy there, whereas can a program be successful independent of how it's perceived by, xenophobes and racists?
Absolutely. And I think, that's the same problem that we're seeing now in Germany. Arguably, the integration of those people who arrived was largely successful. Many of the children who've been born since, who actually carry Merkel's name because their parents are so grateful, are going to schools. You have young men who have gone up through training programs. Is everybody just like becoming German, drinking beer and, joining German clubs with sports? No. But by and large, one could argue that they have been successfully integrated, but it's the same thing. Have they been accepted? The acceptance level in Germany is starting to fray. When they first arrived, I think there was a real sense especially among, and this I found really interesting, among Germans who themselves had been refugees, because the former West Germany would take in quite a number of people from either the former East Germany or
Hmm.
from Poland when Poland was under martial law. So you had a generation of people who they themselves remember what it meant to be seeking refuge in Germany. And they especially opened their doors and their arms and were incredibly proud that Germany, they felt, was doing the right thing. But that euphoria and that sense of pride, that has not lasted across the board.
Hmm. So, how do we define her politically? During her tenure as chancellor, various progressive policies were instituted on climate change, immigration, childcare, minimum wage, same sex marriage. But a lot of people believe those measures passed despite her, as opposed to because of her, that she wasn't really a champion of liberal causes. Was she? How will history judge her politically? How do we define her?
I would say she was a pragmatist.
Hmm.
She went with what she felt was possible and what was doable. And it was interesting because right now, one of the biggest arguments against her is that she didn't do enough to reform the economy. She didn't do enough
Hmm.
to spur innovation. And yet, I can remember standing in one Merkel speech after the other and hearing her go on about how China is not going to wait for us. We need to do more. So she knew what needed to be done, but it was the execution was not always possible. Um, However, you brought up same-sex marriage. So that's an obvious example of classic Merkel maneuvering. It was near an election time. She was standing for election. Her numbers were not so great. She knew full well that a majority of lawmakers were in favor of same-sex marriage. She herself personally was not. She felt marriage is between a man and a woman. That was part of her Christian upbringing, and yet, as a politician, she knew that opening the door to this could work in her favor. So in Germany, when parliament votes, because of the way the parliamentary system works here, normally parties vote in a block. The party is told you're either going to vote yes or you're going to vote no, and that's how you vote. And Merkel specifically suggested that a vote on same-sex marriage could be held where everyone votes their conscience, meaning it's not up to the party to decide how you're going to vote. Everybody votes what they believe in because she knew that the majority believed in this. She herself cast her ballot against it, but it passed and she was fine with it
Hmm.
because that had been her strategy all along. So she was tolerant. I would say you're right. She gets praised for being liberal and certainly, you know, what counts as liberal in Germany is not quite the same as in the
Hmm.
United States. We've got sort of hair splitting in varying degrees and colors of where things fall. But she was very, very pragmatic and willing to go with what she felt was either right or was politically right for her at any given moment, and that the majority wanted.
Hmm. And during the rudderless, dangerous presidential term of Donald Trump, many looked at Merkel as the de facto leader of the free world. Was this a role she was accepting of and comfortable with?
You know, it's really interesting because on the one hand, my knee-jerk reaction is to say absolutely not, not at all. Merkel didn't like to be considered, and Germans themselves of that generation, the Cold War generation, don't like to be leaders. They, try to, oh, Germany can't lead. It's, too dangerous and all.
Hmm.
Um, she actually had fewer problems with like leading in the EU, but when it came to the idea of being the leader of the free world, she really pushed back hard against that term. And yet, uh, when she stood up and gave that speech at Harvard, where, well, and even before then, when she stood up and congratulated Donald Trump, saying, "We are happy to work with you on the basis of," and she read him out, the riot act of this is how liberal democracy works, and this is how, what we're expecting of you. She basically took on this role that she claimed not to really be interested in taking on. And the longer he stayed in office and she stayed in office, the more she grew into it. She would never crow about it, but that picture that her office put out of her leaning over the table, cowering at Trump, and Trump sitting back. Like, these were all very, very calculated moves. Nobody just said, "Oh, this looks like an interesting picture." Merkel was very aware of her image and of the image that was being presented to the public. So in sort of an underhanded way, she was completely into it, but she never would have admitted that.
Mm-hmm. Their relationship was really rocky. They clashed repeatedly over NATO and immigration. There were heated phone conversations, including one which he supposedly called her stupid. She publicly condemned him over January 6th. He referred to her as a bitch. I mean, these are all, I don't know if it's true or not, but
it was not friendly.
It wasn't right. And so what did you uncover? I mean, I know you mentioned her privacy and all that, but do we know what she really privately thought of Donald Trump?
We don't know her deepest inner thoughts, no. We do know that she was shocked that someone who, in her eyes, had so little regard for democracy was leading the country that for her throughout her entire life had been the beacon of democracy. And she credited her freedom in many ways to the United States. The strength, especially of Bush Sr., tamping down the doubts of Thatcher and convincing the Soviets at the time that Germany should be allowed to reunite. And so this to see this country that she's not alone. Many Germans idealize, and she included, in the hands of someone who she felt had so little regard for democracy, really upset her.
Mm-hmm. And so little regard for diplomacy too, right? Remember that there was that moment where Trump sent Ivanka over, and there was that, I'm trying to remember who was in that little group, and I believe Merkel was one of them.
Merkel was there, yes.
Yeah,
but she was like willing to go with Ivanka at the start. She's like, okay, if this is how we get to Donald Trump, we'll work this way.
Right, but there's that famous, that moment where Ivanka's desperately and pathetically trying to weasel her way into that convo, and Merkel is just like, okay, talk to the hand.
Exactly. Yeah. Merkel was willing to try a lot with Trump, but then she got pretty fed up. And the other thing is as you're pointing out, she was devastated by Trump's disregard and attempts to weaken the post-World War II institutions that, in her eyes, are the principles for shoring up democracy. And obviously, we're seeing them crumble now from other sides. Certainly Trump did them all no favors, but like NATO and, all of, the G7, G8, all of these different institutions that were set up as pillars of peace and points where conflicts could be disputed and discussed without having to go to arms. She was a deep believer in that. She was a deep believer in compromise, a deep believer in the power of keeping people in the conversation, even if you don't agree with them. And his disregard for that was deeply upsetting to her. Mm-hmm. And she also thought it was extremely dangerous. It really worried her what was going to happen if the United States, she knew that if the United States retreated from the role it had played in these institutions for so many decades, that there was going to be a vacuum, and she was fearful of who was going to step in and fill it.
Yeah, well, that's really the scary part. I mean, it's not just Donald Trump who doesn't understand America's role and the U.S. presidency's role, but it's also his supporters. They really have no clue about geopolitics and the role we play in stabilizing the world. Ukraine is a perfect example of that. They talk about it in such transactional terms, like money going there is not money spent here on our people. Like, they have no clue about how America has been the great protector over the years of democracy against tyranny, and look at how we're slipping into our own little neo-fascist state. It is dangerous and scary. So she was
absolutely
definitely right
on that. It is. Yeah, and the other thing I think that Americans often forget about Germany is how utterly close it is to Russia. Mm-hmm. Well, two things. One, it is very close to Russia. The only thing standing between Russia and Germany is Poland. Mm-hmm. And Poland, as we all know, has been gone over throughout history many, many times. And There's also a deep-seated gratitude in many Germans to the Soviets for freeing them along with the Americans. But like the Germans don't forget that the Soviets were part of the Allies after World War II, and especially Germans who are from the former East, because they grew up, someone like Merkel grew up chatting in Russian with Soviet soldiers who were stationed in her town. She loves the Russian language, the literature, the culture, but it's sort of, I think growing up in the Midwest as an American, Russia was the ultimate like foreign thing, right? E- East Germans and Germans in general are less. It's more Russian is more familiar to them. It's part of Europe, and so this American approach often to that is, that Americans expect the Germans to feel the same way about the Russians that Americans do. The Germans just don't get that.
Hmm. What would you say are a couple of her greatest strengths and successes as chancellor?
I think one of her greatest strengths, for sure, was she, I mean, it's so hard to say this now because Germany's economy since 22, when she left office, has nosedived, and there's been a lot of finger pointing back at Merkel. But in that time that she was in office, Germany rode this wave of prosperity. Unemployment, dropped, and there were jobs increased. There was a lot of work, and Germans found themselves, I think, Merkel ushered in a new generation of Germans. I remember in 2006 when early on, the year after she took office, Germany hosted the World Soccer Championship, and people came to Germany for the first time, really, since it had been reunified, and looked around and were like, "Wow, this place is actually pretty great." They had fun. Okay, the weather cooperated, but there was this real sense of a new Germany emerging. Germans were suddenly proud to be German. They would wave their flag where during the Cold War that never would have happened. And Merkel represented to the world this sort of new, very diplomatic Germany, that people had not really seen before. Certainly, the shadow of World War II hung very strongly over Germany. She did manage also to keep the European Union together when in the Greek debt crisis, which it also involved Italy, Ireland, Spain. She managed to hold Europe together. She managed
Mm.
to keep everybody on board. It was disputed, were the policies that she pushed through too harsh, but Europe did not break apart, and there was a real threat that Europe would break apart. And she became very, very respected as a leader in the eyes of the other Europeans. And previous to that, Germany had always been feared by some of its European partners because, let's face it, they have a reason to fear Germany. History here is very present in many ways. And yet, Germany was able to lead without being fearful.
What about flaws or failures?
Failures. Well, I've sort of touched on this. One of her biggest failures was this inability to revive the economy, or to put the economy in position to be competitive in the face of China. Germany lags behind in digitization, behind the United States, behind China. The internet came up in the US and everyone was like, "Oh, this is amazing. What can we do with it?" And the Germans went, "Oh, people can spy on me with this. This is terrifying." And the country has yet to overcome this. There's a lot of innovation that goes on at a small level, but there's also loads of paperwork that people get, and red tape that trip people up. And under Merkel, there was so much money. There was this wave of prosperity. Some of that could have been used to invest more in innovation. She will also, in the eyes of some, be blamed for the rise of the far right because of the immigration issue, because she did decide that the country could handle more than 1 million migrants, taking them in and integrating them. And whether it's really a generational question, right? Where we really won't know, did that succeed for many years yet to come? But in the eyes of many Germans, it was the wrong decision, and that has led to the rise of the far right in Germany, far-right political parties that are playing pretty prominent roles, winning state elections, and splintering the country in ways that it hasn't been for decades.
Mm-hmm. And my last question, in what ways will Merkel's tenure as chancellor serve as a model for other world leaders? And perhaps even more importantly, where do you think she will fit in? How will history judge her as not just a world leader, but a female world leader? Will she be remembered as one of the great ones in history?
It's a really good question. I think for women, certainly she will, because there was always something really, as a woman, raising kids, working and finding myself in Germany often, certainly in the early noughts, as a professional woman, like the only woman in the room, which I thought, how is this possible in the year 2000? And so to show up at every press conference where you had whichever world leader standing there with the chancellor, and that chancellor was a woman, I think it made a profound just sort of difference. The joke was that there were little boys who asked when Merkel was stepping down, Mommy, can a man be a chancellor? Because there was a generation that only knew a woman as a chancellor. And I think the more women who take on these strong roles do open doors for others. I'm so fascinated watching Kamala Harris's campaign. And one of the things, Harris doesn't want to talk about the fact that she's a woman. Mm-hmm. She doesn't want to talk about the fact that she's Black or Indian. She wants to talk about, her policies or what she's going to do. That's classic Merkel. Mm-hmm. Merkel didn't want to talk about being a woman. She didn't want to be called a feminist. She was going to be the chancellor for all Germans. She also didn't want to be an East German or what. Mm-hmm. She was doing her job. And, I have not asked Kamala Harris. I do know that she met Merkel. Merkel, interestingly, when Biden won, when Merkel congratulated Biden, she also congratulated Kamala Harris as the first in German is a gendered language. So by saying, as the vice presidentin, which signifies that she's a woman. And Merkel did not congratulate Mike Pence. So when Merkel then went to Washington for her inaugural visit with Biden, she also sat down and had breakfast with Kamala Harris. And I think, to me, that really is her biggest legacy, that a woman reigned. She wasn't the queen. A woman held power for 16 years over a successful period for one of the world's leading economies.
Mm-hmm. Well, the book, Merkel's Law, Wisdom from the Woman Who Led the Free World, it is out. Thank you for a really compelling conversation about a pretty fascinating individual. Good luck with the book.
Thank you, Andy.
Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.